I was really excited to see the release of Tanstack Form. I was doubly excited to see them treating Angular as a first class citizen right out of the box. I've been digging into it a bit, and I just wanted to show a few quick things. There's way more to this than I'll be able to show here, but as you might know, Angular is in kind of a weird place right now with regard to forms. The reactive forms module in Angular relies on observables, and we're still waiting for a new signal based form library. I think Tanstack Form not only will fill that gap, but looks like a viable option going forward. So I've created just a simple little form here with a couple pieces of data. I'm going to install the new Tanstack Angular Form package here and convert this. And while that installs, maybe we'll take a look at what I have here. So it's just a simple form where you can enter in your name and your desired username. And I'm going to use the Tanstack form to hook this up and talk about validations, async validations, and some of the debouncing functionality. So in Visual Studio Code here, all I've done is I've created a form. I have a little handle submit on there that just hijacks the form, doesn't let it actually try to submit. There's nothing in here at all that is Tanstack form yet. So the starting point on this is you create, I'm going to call it, give it the clever name of form, and I'm going to use inject form. And this comes from Tanstack form. So I'm going to have to do, because I just installed it, Tanstack Angular form. And when you use inject form, you give it an object and it has a bunch of properties you can set. The one I'm going to do is default values for this. So relies heavily on inference in TypeScript. So we don't have to use types, but of course you can if you want. So I know I'm going to have a name and a username. GitHub Copilot's helping me out here a little bit. And I want to map these to these two different inputs on the form. So there's my input for their name and their desired username. Maybe I'll even throw some sample data in here. So sample name, just so we can see it's working, and uh, F as my sample username here. So the way this works is I'm going to kind of hijack this wrapping div for this, and I'm going to use a directive called tanstack field and apply it on this. And you tell it what form you're using, and then what is the name of the field that you're connecting to. So I have this form, and the form has a field called name. So this is going to kind of wrap that up a little bit. And you can also give it a name, and that directive has an output called field. So I just created a temporary a variable, a template variable called name here. And then I can use that for things like I don't have a for attribute on here. So I could say for name dot get this to show. So it has an API property that has the name of this thing. And for the input itself, I'm going to use pretty much everything available. If I want to set an ID, for example, that would be name.api.name. I could also set a name attribute, which is name.api.name. I will set that attribute on it. For the value, I'm going to set this to name.api.state.value. And for maybe I'll hook up for blur when they move off of this thing, name.api handle blur, built-in little thing. Oops. And on input, I'm going to use name.api handle change, and I'm going to use the little, because it doesn't know the data types, the little template thing that doesn't come from Tanstack, that's just Angular. So on that event, target dot value. Oh, that back to my browser. Sample name shows up here. That here, leave the one in for username for right now. Then on this handle submit here, remember this is just the thing that's hijacking the HTML form. I could do this dot form handle submit, and it will call whatever method we put on here on submit. And yeah, I'll just console log it out. We'll talk about some other things here. But if I go back to the browser, open my dev tools, hit enter, you can see get this form submitted. It has this meta thing, an access to the form API and the values. So the name is Jeff and the username, because remember I had that hard coded in the form, is Jeff. So if all we wanted was that value property, pluck that out. If we can, oops, we didn't need access to the form meta stuff. Submitted. The validation story here is pretty good. I'm going to show you a couple examples. I'm going to start with just writing some manual validation functions, some synchronous validation functions. You can also use any library that uses the common schema standard. So I'll show a demonstration of using Zod to write your validation function. So I'm just going to add on here, maybe the simplest, we'll have a name validator. And it just has a function that takes the value that's going to be a string because it's a string input type. And yeah, I think I'll just go along with what this is telling me. But in the end, you return undefined if there's no errors. So the name validator takes the value, and if there isn't a value, it's going to tell me the name's required, or that will be the error. And if it's less than 3, you can add whatever the other validation logic you wanted here to apply this on the div with the Tanstack field here. I'm going to add another input called validators, and you give it an object. And there's various levels of validation you can do on change. So anytime any change happens in there, so as they type, there is on blur, which is, since we're handling blur, when they tab out of it, if that's when you wanted the validation to happen. And then there's also on submit. So if you only wanted this validator to run when they submit the field, you could put that here. I'm just going to do it on change and tell it to use that name validator. And with that right now, what you'll notice is if I go back to my browser and maybe clear out my terminal, if I put something decent in here like Mary do it, I'll get the submit. But if I don't have any values in there and hit the button, nothing's happening. It's blocking the submission because it is running those validators. Now, of course, we'll want to show some kind of message here, etc. Another thing we could do just to kind of throw this into the demonstration is there's another method on submit invalid, and you can see do that. The name is doesn't have a name, the username there is there, etc. Show some error messages. I won't go too far with this because everybody has their way of doing it, but maybe right after this label right here, I'm going to do if the name API state dot meta dot errors do little div, the class of validator hint, they join them together. That so back here, name must be at least 3 characters. Name is required. Now, I personally feel like immediately showing them an error while they're typing, like, hey, you don't have enough letters yet, is a little distracting and a little aggressive. So even these synchronous validators like this that we've written can be run asynchronously and debounced. There's automatic support for debouncing on these. So I'm going to go back up to the template and change this to on change async, and then just say only run this. There's an input on this. I'm going to say this async debounce milliseconds. Yeah, maybe 500 milliseconds. So that will give the user enough time to type the full thing in before they get an error. If I just type one letter, 500 milliseconds later, it's going to show that error, JE, 500 milliseconds later. But if I type in something that's long enough, they won't actually get the error. Another thing I can do is maybe on this label itself, actually maybe on the input, I'm going to tell it I'm using Tailwind and the Daisy UI library, which I use a lot. Some production apps, mostly just for prototyping, stuff like that. But if you add a class to this that is of type input error, so if I just do put error, I want it to show like that if there is actually an error, and if there's only if there's an error. I'm trying to avoid using those structural directives like ng class and all that stuff. So another technique you can use is class input error. Set that to some kind of expression. So maybe if the name dot API dot state dot meta is touched and it has errors, then I'm telling Angular to add that to its class list. Oh, hard coded one. Length on here. It's always going to be an empty array after there's a first error. Clarify that. No error. An error now, JE. There's an error, F. Okay, I'm going to set up the username and install Zod, validation library, and I'll just hurriedly do this and speed it up. So if I switch to the browser, put my username in here. Get rid of that hard-coded username. There won't be a default for that. And if I want to set up some validations, I'm going to port E do take the autocomplete here. I'm telling this validator that it has to be a string, Has a minimum of 3, a maximum of 20, and even use little regular expressions, etc. I take the default suggestion here from GitHub Copilot just to show that this can work. So on that, and we could just borrow this little div there. So with Zod, that's going to actually return an array of objects, which we can do from our validation functions as well. So there's two errors with this right now. So maybe we can, if we wanted to see what was going on here, I could import the JSON pipe instead of joining these together. Take a look at it. Object with a property of code, too small, minimum. This is what Zod's producing. Then it has a message. String must contain at least 3 characters. And then this regular expression problem here too is what is an issue. But if I go in and put something in like Jeff space, that regular expression is saying it can't have any spaces in it. It has to be a string like that. So to customize the messages, we could just go in and username must be 3 characters, must be at most 20 characters, and do something like that. Username. Something like that. So we could do the whole async thing here as well. Not going to duplicate ourselves, just to give you a sense of using other validation libraries. Okay, to give one example of a pretty real use case, I'm going to create an asynchronous validator for this, and we'll call it maybe username available validator. And you can use whatever technique you want. You could use, the resource API, any of that kind of stuff. I'm just going to do a fetch here and value. I'm going to do an HTTP head request to HTTPS fake API.dev users username uh, with the value. And it's going to be a head request because I'm not actually asking for any data back. And what I'm hoping for actually is a 404. In this case, the 404 would mean a success because it means there is nobody with that username. You can have it. If I get a 200, that's an error. So when I get this back, um, I'm going to say, yeah, if the response status code, I'm going to return a message saying that's already taken. If it's 404, I'm going to return undefined. We could also, you know, say if for some reason we weren't able to make the request, thing like that, um, we can do. And just so you know, I actually have that set up with use mock service workers. So it's going to intercept this call. And the only username that this system has right now is the username studboy. So that will indicate this. So now we can just add on our validators username, well, bounce of 1,000 milliseconds here. I'm gonna make one little change here because the way we handled theirs before, and I said you could do this, I'm just gonna return objects with a message property. Say the username's already taken. Go with my old standby, and that seems okay. We can put a little indicator on the screen, maybe up after this label, so we can show a little message here. If it's in the process of validating.